The St. Louis Gang Wars. At the turn of the century, St. Louis was a hotbed of ethnic gangs, dominated by Irish and Italian factions vying for control over the street-level rackets in their area. The most popular in St. Louis was extortion, burglary, robbery, and political enforcement. These groups emerged from immigrant enclaves amid rapid urbanization, exploiting weak law enforcement and corrupt political machines to dominate their local vice district. By far the most popular racket for the Italians was Black Hand extortion, with activity reported in the city as early as 1876. Loosely organized groups of Italian extortionists will run around terrorizing their own immigrant Italian community. It would be the money-making potential of Prohibition that prompted these mobsters to organize themselves into formally structured gangs with some sort of hierarchy. Gangs then expanded from pre-Prohibition rackets like gambling and extortion into bootlegging, which quickly generated obscene profits for these immigrant criminal groups, amplifying their power and influence. This influx of revenue, estimated to generate millions annually citywide, intensified competition, as control over supply chains and territories promised dominance in a market where federal enforcement was inconsistent. Rival ethnic gangs erupted into the liquor wars of the 1920s, marked by over 100 gang-related murders that earned St. Louis a reputation as the nation's murder capital. The gangs that thrived during Prohibition in St. Louis were still burgeoning entities, not as large, formidable, or organized as, for example, the underworld factions in Chicago or Detroit. Instead, St. Louis would play host to several smaller gangs, battling it out for underworld supremacy, with the Irish gangs being the most prominent early on. The streets of St. Louis would set the stage for years of brutal gangland warfare, as these crews would all battle one another, creating a gangland Royal Rumble of sorts as they battled for dominance. The St. Louis crime family would eventually emerge from the surviving members of these early Italian and Sicilian factions who would consolidate influence by forming pragmatic alliances that shared profits and territories. This shift toward cooperation reduced open warfare and laid the groundwork for the hierarchical structures that would evolve into the Cosa Nostra mafia family in St. Louis once these Italian mobsters who made it through these beer wars come together to function as one family. A lot of people have to die before that happens. During the Prohibition era in St. Louis, there were 7 different ethnic gangs facing off against each other. These Prohibition era gangs were known to have some funky names, and St. Louis was no different. You had the Bottoms Gang, Egan's Rats, the Green Ones, the Hogan Gang, the Russo Gang, the Pillow Gang, and the Cuckoo Gang. Early on in St. Louis, gangs were created to advance the political agenda of those in power at the time. One of the earliest was the violent Bottoms Gang of the 22nd Ward. Originating in neighborhoods with feeble tenements, saloons, brothels, and gambling dens, the rough district ran slightly lower elevation than the surrounding areas and was alternately known as the Badlands or the Bottoms, hence the nickname. They had their roots in the politics that infested St. Louis city wards at the very beginning of the 20th century. These young hoodlums would use violence to control the votes. Led by Edward Schoenborn, the Bottoms Gang catered to Democratic political boss Colonel Ed Butler. These young men inaugurated a reign of terror on the streets of St. Louis in 1905. Often fueled by alcohol and cocaine, these boys attacked, robbed, pillaged across the 22nd Ward, committing crimes like burglary, assault, armed robbery, gang rape, and of course murder. The number one enemy of the Bottoms Gang was the larger and more powerful Egan's Rats Gang. Beginning as a political organization founded in the late 1800s by Missouri State Senator Thomas Snake Kinney and St. Louis 5th Ward Democratic Committeeman Thomas Egan, by 1907 the group became a powerhouse in the St. Louis underworld and were known as Egan's Rats. Initially serving as muscle for the local Democratic political machine, besides vote manipulation, the Rats specialized in burglaries, railroad car thefts, and armed robberies. The gang was full of ruthless killers who were willing to assassinate anyone, anywhere, regardless of the consequences. Thomas Snake Kinney was born and raised in the Cary Patch, a well-known Irish neighborhood in the St. Louis waterfront. Kinney was a local street tough who became a Democratic politician. At about 1890, Kinney founded the Ashley Street Gang. The gang started primarily as a political enforcement crew aligned with the city's Democratic political machine. The gang provided muscle to intimidate opponents and manipulate elections through voter harassment at polling stations, ballot stuffing, and repeat voting. This symbolic relationship with the Democratic Party elevated the gang's status and exemplified how raw physical intimidation translated into systematic political leverage, sustaining the gang's operations until they began escalating their criminal pursuits. These efforts blurred the lines between criminal enterprise and governance. Outside the political arena, the group focused on low-level offenses such as pickpocketing, sneak thievery, and small burglaries to make ends meet amid limited economic opportunities. By the mid-1890s, the Ashley Street Gang had transitioned into Egan's Rats, named after a derogatory police remark labeling Egan's associates as rats during a booking incident, marking their shift toward more structured criminal enforcement while leveraging political connections for impunity. Kenny started off in life as a newsboy, which would build his street fighting experience. Reason being, back then when a newsboy sold all their papers, they would find, beat up, and rob other newsboys. Snake Kenny would eventually drift into politics and was elected to the Missouri State Senate. And even though he was now a politician, he remained very close to Tom Egan, even marrying Egan's sister. Despite being looked at as a white-collar gangster and a political figure, Snake Kenny wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He was indeed a tough guy, an accomplished street fighter, pool hustler, and gambler. An example of his street fighting prowess was when he faced off against his biggest early rival, George Baldy Higgins, an alcoholic sadist who was jealous of Snake's success. Kenny killed Higgins in a street fight in the early morning hours of September 20th, 1896. Snake beat him to death and then was acquitted on the charge of self-defense. Kenny's best friend and partner in crime, Thomas Egan, grew up right across the street from him. Egan was a saloon keeper, politician, and gang boss involved in bootlegging, illegal gambling, voter intimidation, labor slugging, and a whole lot of other criminal activities. Egan, along with some of his childhood friends, began running with the Ashley Street Gang. In those early days, they engaged in picking pockets and small-time burglaries on top of vote manipulation. During one such burglary attempt on October 17, 1894, Egan was shot through the face by a cop. He survived but was left with a prominent scar on his jaw. Around 1904, Tom Egan took complete control of the gang when Snake Kenny went into politics full-time. Kenny still used the gang to his advantage whenever possible. He used them on election days to chase away, intimidate, or strong-arm voters. It was the ultimate goal of Colonel Butler, Schoenborn, and the Bottoms Boys to unseat the Kenny-Egan Combine as the dominant Democratic force in the city of St. Louis. The two gangs had an epic clash during the Democratic primary on October 6, 1906. Bottoms gang members marched into the 15th Ward and openly confronted the Rats, leading to a violent brawl at the polls that lasted all day. Tommy Egan's notoriety would skyrocket in 1907 when he shot and killed one of his longtime enemies, Willie Gagel, in the Jolly Five Club, and was acquitted of the murder. Then, a few months later, Egan gunned down James Kid Wilson and would again be acquitted of the murder. There's something you don't hear every day. Acquitted of 2 murders in the same year. Tommy Egan's name already rang bells throughout the St. Louis underworld. After beating 2 murder raps back to back, he became a household name. Egan was known to be brutal and cunning, but at this point he was recognized as one of the most powerful crime bosses in the Midwest. The Rats became more ruthless and feared as the murders kept piling up. The gang wasn't afraid to kill in public either. An example of this would be the brazen murder they committed on June 7, 1909 in a crowded courthouse. Bottoms gangster Fred Yellow Kid Marley previously killed an Egan's Rats member and was going on trial for murder. Thomas Red Kane was a longtime friend of the slain rat and wanted to be the one to get revenge. His opportunity arrived during a break on the trial's opening day. As Marley spoke with a friend in the hallway outside the courtroom, Kane calmly walked up to him. He pulled his revolver and before dozens of witnesses blew a hole through Yellow Kid's head. Kane nearly emptied the cylinder as he poured 4 more bullets into Marley's body. He then made a dash from the building. The murder sent shockwaves throughout St. Louis. Never before has the city witnessed such a brash murder. The incident was front-page news. It was the first time many of the common folk had ever heard of Egan's Rats, and reporters struggled to explain the organization and its purpose. This event was so significant because the gang's fearsome reputation was really born in the hallway of the 4 courts that afternoon. After June of '09, virtually no one in St. Louis openly crossed Egan's Rats. The only ones that dared were the cocaine-riddled, self-destructive Bottoms gang, and they would strike back less than a year later when they gave the Rats a taste of their own medicine. A couple bottom shooters managed to blast Rats member John Badjack Barry while he was sitting in a Northside courtroom in February 1910, killing him as well. By 1912, Egan's Rats were at their peak with about 300 to 400 men strong and were the most powerful and dominant gang in St. Louis and virtually untouchable. But like a bad rash, the Bottoms gang just wouldn't go away. Despite their violent reputation, Rats members thought of them as bottom of the barrel. Their rivalry marks the earliest gang feud in St. Louis and one of the earliest in recorded U.S. history. The roots of this strife lay with Egan gunman Harry Cherries Dunn, who blamed gang boss Tom Egan for letting his brother John go to an Illinois prison with little to no assistance. Frustrated with Egan, Dunn decided to make a deal with the cops and snitch on his gangmates in order to get his brother sprung from jail, so he went to police headquarters to express his interest in cooperating. As he left, he just so happened to bump into an OG from the Egan's Rats gang, one of the gang's original members, William Skippy Rohan, who happened to be checking in with his parole officer. The two exchanged brief pleasantries as they passed each other and went on with their lives. Cherries Dunn was getting increasingly paranoid the more he thought about bumping into Rohan leaving the cop shop. Surely he's gonna say something and Tom Egan will find out about his disloyalty and kill him, he thought to himself. Dunn eventually convinced himself that because of that chance encounter he's as good as dead. He became high-strung and paranoid, causing him to act irrational and jumpy. Meanwhile, Skippy Rohan was oblivious to any of this. At this point, Rohan was a war-torn old-timer who's been in and out of jail his whole life and is trying to stay on the straight and narrow. Then, on the evening of January 7th, 1916, Skippy Rohan and a friend were having a few drinks at Tommy Egan's saloon. As they were sitting at the bar, Cherries Dunn barged in. The nervous and high-strung Dunn called Rohan a snitch. Before the confused Rohan could say anything, Dunn pulled his gun and shot him in the face, followed by another to the chest, killing him. Dunn felt like he had to do something to prevent Skippy from telling anyone about his visit to the police station, when in reality Skippy could care less and never made the connection of what Dunn was up to that afternoon. If Cherries Dunn was afraid of boss Tommy Egan wanting to kill him, killing his longtime friend in his bar where violence was not allowed sure didn't help his cause. In a move he'll soon regret, Willie Egan was able to save Dunn from being killed for the time being, but it seems Dunn's time with the Rats has run its course. Cherries Dunn happened to be good friends with the current leader of the Bottoms gang, Edward Schoenborn, so he defected over to the rival gang. Dunn then instigated a full-blown war with the Rats when he killed Harry Ramundi, a semi-pro boxer and crook allied with the Egan gang. Willie Egan, feeling like he made a huge mistake by sticking up for Dunn earlier, wanted to right that wrong, so he and a few other Rat members went out to hunt him down and take him out. The whole Egan mob was looking for Dunn. After killing a few more Rats members, Dunn took refuge at the Typo Press Club. Then a hit team led by Willie Egan himself tracked him down and killed him there on September 19, 1916. 3 weeks later, Rat assassins tracked down Bottoms boss Edward Schoenborn at the old saloon and shot him dead as well. A tit-for-tat war ensued throughout the rest of the fall and into 1917. John Pudgy Dunn was finally released from prison and swore to kill every man connected with his brother's death. He succeeded in killing one of the triggermen, but that's about it. The Bottoms gang took scores of losses and evaporated by the end of the summer of 1917. Tom Egan was a bit of a visionary and accurately predicted Prohibition coming and constructed a whiskey smuggling network as early as 1910, though he would never get to reap the rewards of his foresight. In late 1918, Egan was diagnosed with a degenerative kidney disease, then known as Bright's disease. He died in April 1919. He was only 44. Thomas Snake Kinney wasn't around anymore either. He died from tuberculosis a few years earlier. Leadership was then passed to Tommy's younger brother. Now Willie Egan was the 5th Ward boss and the leader of the Rats. Egan's Rats soon became embroiled in another gang war, an even more violent one, with Tom Egan's longtime political rival Edward Hogan and his gang rightfully dubbed the Hogan Gang. The Hogan Gang, much like the Egan Gang, were prominently made up of Irish-American gangsters, though they did have quite a few Jewish and Italian gangsters in their ranks as well. Their fearless leader, Edward Jelly Roll Hogan, was the son of a St. Louis police captain and a local saloon keeper who had gone into state politics in the 1910s. Known by his unflattering nickname Jelly Roll due to his hefty build, Hogan was a multi-term Missouri state representative and senator. He was known as the persnickety type that would fly off the handle from time to time, that once beat up a man on the Missouri state capitol steps in broad daylight. He left politics in the spring of 1920, taking the Prohibition years off for escapades exceedingly more profitable and much more illegal. Running his gang and enterprises from his headquarters at Jefferson and Cass, Hogan got himself named as Deputy Inspector of the State Beverage Department of Missouri in 1920. The job provided a bit of irony, as Hogan's duty was to make sure all beverages produced in Missouri were non-alcoholic, while he's actively engaged in producing alcoholic beverages. Now, although their booze-selling territories encroached upon each other, the two gangs didn't approach all-out warfare until the winter of 1921. The Egan-Hogan War in 1921-23 had its origins with Egan Lieutenant Big Maxie Greenberg. Greenberg, along with a couple other Rat members, were sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary on an interstate theft charge stemming from an Egan-sponsored robbery in some railroad cars in Danville, Illinois. William Kinney and Tom Kinney's brother, Missouri State Senator Michael Kinney, managed to finagle the three men pardons from none other than President Woodrow Wilson himself, and the men were released after serving only 6 months of a 5-year sentence. Soon after his release, Greenberg decided to go into the bootlegging racket for himself. He accomplished this by betraying the very same man who saved him from prison, Willie Egan. Egan gave Greenberg $2,000 to make a deal with a Mexican smuggler for a load of whiskey. Big Maxie paid the smuggler but kept the whiskey for himself. Egan was furious and demanded that Greenberg reimburse him, but Max claimed the whiskey barge sank in the Mississippi River. Then tensions came to a head in the early morning hours of October 16, 1920, when Greenberg and his friends engaged the rest of the Rats in a huge brawl at Egan's saloon. A few months later, Willie Egan gave Greenberg one last chance to account for the missing whiskey. The two, along with Max's buddy, political activist John Sweeney, met at a street corner in downtown St. Louis on March 11, 1921. Greenberg again refused to pay. As the meeting broke up, a lone gunman appeared out of the shadows and started shooting. Sweeney was killed and Greenberg was shot through the jaw but survived. That was it for Max. In the wake of this attempt on his life, Greenberg defected to the rival Hogan Gang. The Rats took a major loss on Halloween of 21. Willie Egan was gunned down in front of his saloon. Egan's right-hand man, Dinty Colbeck, was there when Egan was shot and ran over to his side just in time for Willie to tell him who his assassins were before he died, solidifying retribution to the perpetrators. A week later, Greenberg walked into police headquarters with Hogan lawyer Jacob Mackler and provided an airtight alibi. Despite most of the gang assuming Jelly Roll and the Hogan Gang were behind Egan's murder, Greenberg's actions seemed suspicious to Rat's new boss, William Dinty Colbeck. The alibi didn't satisfy his suspicions. Dinty Colbeck, or Dint as his associates called him, was a husky plumber and a former World War I infantryman. Colbeck had surmised that Greenberg had arranged Egan's murder and the lawyer was the payoff man. The intuition of the new boss proved to be spot on. It was uncovered that Big Maxie did indeed pay to have Egan whacked. It was on now. The two gangs declared war on one another. But the first order of business, to track down Willie Egan's killers. Unfortunately for the Rats, Egan was able to pass along the identity of his killers to Colbeck before he died. Colbeck subsequently put an open contract on the guilty parties, who were Jelly Roll's brother James Hogan, John Doyle, and the Hogan Gang's top hitter and marksman Luke Kennedy. The first to go is John Doyle. 1922 kicked off with his demise as he was gunned down in the street in January. Not long after, a car full of rat gunmen spotted Mackler, Kennedy, and James Hogan cruising along in another car. They tailed them for a while, and when they got close enough, they pulled alongside and started blasting. Kennedy took a critical shot in the leg, and a shotgun blast took off Mackler's derby, but miraculously nobody was killed. The press is loving this. They're definitely keeping score, and they don't miss anything. The Hogan Gang responded by murdering Rat member George Kurloff in a local restaurant. The Rats retaliated by dispatching the bodies of Joseph Camerata, Joseph Coppola, and Everett Summers in ditches along Lowland County roads. As spring rolled along, the bodies kept piling up, with the Hogans taking most of the losses. Perhaps their biggest loss would come in April of 22, when a Rat hit team was able to corner Luke Kennedy and shot him to death. An informant told police Kennedy was begging for his life and his killers taunted him before they opened fire. Losing their prized hitter was demoralizing for the Hogan Gang. The bloodletting continued, with innocent bystanders being caught in the action as the battle raged with police chases, ambushes, and drive-bys. Up to this point, the Hogan Gang was hit with most of the casualties. In a daring move, Jelly Roll Hogan and his crew shut up Dink Colbeck's plumbing store, which earned them retaliation the next day when the Egan mob did a drive-by shooting at Hogan's house. Hogan's parents, who were home at the time, had to die for cover. Over a 2-year period, the death toll in the Egan Cats Hogan Gang War reached 23. By this time, the St. Louis public had become appalled by the open gang violence. Local priest Tim Dempsey privately interviewed members of both gangs and persuaded them to agree to make peace in June of 22. Soon after this, several armed Hogan Gang members escorted Greenberg to Union Station and put him on a train to New York. The treaty left Egan's Rats as the dominant bootlegging mob in St. Louis, but their members continued to antagonize the defeated Hogan Gang. At one point after a bank robbery, Chippy Robinson called the police anonymously and claimed that the Hogans were responsible. Jelly Roll and some of his men were indeed arrested because of the tip. They were all cleared of the charges later, though. Greenberg managed to escape the wrath of Colbeck and the gang violence he helped cause. Now out in the East Coast, Big Maxie was playing in the big sandbox where the real deal mafiosi roam, where he might not be so lucky next time. Once in the Big Apple, Greenberg was doing big things. He would reunite with his old pal Waxy Gordon. The pair, partnered with Max Hassel and backed by Arnold Rothstein, would start a large-scale rum-running business, delivering alcohol to several high-class hotels in Manhattan and other deserving establishments. The bootleg operation became one of the biggest and most successful in the country and had about a 5-year run. The Jewish bootleggers would eventually get pressed to join the new national crime syndicate headed by New York crime boss Charlie Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky, but they resisted. Then on April 12, 1933, Greenberg, Gordon, and Hassel attended a meeting with some of their bootlegging associates at the Carteret Hotel in New Jersey. Shortly after the meeting started, Waxy Gordon got up and left the room. A few minutes later, 2 gunmen burst in the room and opened fire, killing both Greenberg and Hassel. One of their associates heard the shots and scurried back to the room, only to find both their shot-up bodies slumped on the floor. Frankie Carbo from Murder Inc. was later arrested for the double murder. He would sit in jail for 6 months before they cut him loose due to lack of evidence. It has since been alleged that Mayor Lansky, Abner Zwillman, and Joe Adonis ordered Greenberg's death in order to consolidate their control over bootlegging operations in North Jersey. Max refusing to join their bootlegging cartel probably didn't help either. Meanwhile, in St. Louis, tension still ran high as rival gangsters were still taking shots at each other despite the truce. Only a few months after the treaty, rat gunmen opened up on a crowd after spotting the last Egan triggerman still alive, James Hogan. They missed him and 2 innocent people were shot and killed. The peace treaty was broken for good in February 23 when Dent Colbeck and his men ambushed and killed Hogan lawyer Jacob Mackler when 15 shots found their mark that were fired into his automobile. And again, shooting swept through the city. Not long after that, rat gunmen shot up Jelly Roll Hogan's house once again. In March of 23, a couple rats tried to ambush Jelly Roll Hogan, firing shots at his car while he was driving along the road. 2 of the shooters were arrested and Hogan was brought to police headquarters to identify him. His response was, "I'll identify him all right. I'll identify him with a shotgun." By now, the public outcry had reached a fever pitch. City officials openly discussed bringing in the U.S. Marines or National Guard to restore order. It was ultimately the work of St. Louis priest Tim Dempsey, several police officials, and a St. Louis Star reporter that brought the war to its final end. They did things a little different back then. They had Colbeck and Hogan write letters to the people of St. Louis telling them that their feud was finished, and both letters were published in the paper. Now at peace, the rats began a crime wave of robbery and murder in Missouri and Illinois. The gang was ruthless with anyone who crossed them, even their own members. The dynamic of power in the St. Louis underworld was shifting away from the traditional political clubs and political-based crimes to a more open and broad criminal enterprise, where the overall focus is on profits and revenue rather than political aspirations or agenda. There was also a particular faction of Egan gang members who desired to make money through more quick and decisive means. They preferred the more high-risk, high-reward jobs rather than the traditional and more reliable, slow and steady mob rackets. They didn't have the patience for that. What made these guys' juices flow was armed robbery, more specifically, bank and mail truck robbery. These gangsters tended to be younger and more violent than their political war-trained predecessors. Police would nickname them the Red Hots, as such criminal behavior tended to upset the apple cart and attract unwanted attention from police. These guys robbed so many banks they fine-tuned their technique and eventually became seasoned pros. One notable robbery worth mentioning was the Big Baden Bank robbery of 1919. The heist went down without a hitch, but their narrow escape was something you'd expect to see from a blockbuster Hollywood movie. That robbery wasn't committed by a bunch of wild and brazen kids. No sir, these guys were disciplined and seasoned professionals. On that chilly April morning, a vehicle containing 8 men parked by the side entrance of the bank. 2 men remained in the front seat with the meter running while the other 6 exited the vehicle. All 8 men were dressed identically in light gray raincoats and plaid flat caps. The 5 masked intruders leveled identical Army-issued Colt .45 caliber automatic pistols at the startled employees. Fortunately, there were no customers in the bank to deal with, so the armed quintet quickly strolled through the door that led behind the counter and cage. As 3 gunmen kept the employees covered, the other 2 produced cloth sacks and began gathering up stacks of cash from the shelf before cleaning out the loot from the open vault. The robbers also searched counter and desk drawers for any money. As they made their getaway, a passing foot patrolman was rousted by the commotion. The officer commandeered a passing mail truck and ordered the driver to give chase. Standing on the truck's running board and hanging on with his left arm, the officer fired on the Hudson with a service revolver. One of the bandits leaned out the Hudson's passenger side window and returned fire with his .45 automatic. It was an intense scene, but no one was hit during the moving gun battle. The Hudson's driver hung a sharp right turn and almost hit a pedestrian. Undeterred, the getaway driver gunned the Hudson up the avenue's steep incline and threaded the needle between the Calvary and Bellefontaine cemeteries. The larger mail truck had a difficult time hitting the same turns and fell behind. The robbers were last seen turning south on West Florissant Avenue, and then they were gone. It was eventually determined that the Egan crew got away with $59,000 in cash. It was the largest bank robbery in St. Louis's history up to that point, and will remain so for another 11 years. The Egan's Rats gang was building up its underworld prestige. After the successful robbery, the Rats were known as a formidable criminal organization, rather than just a street gang focused on politics and petty street crimes. In the midst of it all, Colbeck maintained the gang's rackets. Headquartered at a roadhouse called the Maxwellton Club, the Rats increasingly looked toward their armed robberies for income. It was later estimated that the Rats stole nearly $4.5 million in cash and property from 1919 to 1924. The robberies mentioned in this video represent only a fraction of the heists Egan's Rats pulled off during that 5-year span. On April 2nd, 1923, Egan's Rats teamed up with some members of the Cuckoo Gang and knocked off a mail truck, netting a take of $2.4 million in negotiable bonds. These boys were on a roll, because the following month they struck again, swiping $55,000 in cash from the Staunton, Illinois postmaster. Those big scores were huge for these guys back then, but they would also lead to the gang's demise. By now the police were pissed and turned up the heat with the questioning. They eventually made it to a gang member with very little backbone named Ray Renard, and the mere threat of a prison sentence made Renard flip faster than an Olympic gymnast, and he agreed to rat on all his gang buddies. Renard's testimony was devastating for both the Rats and the Cuckoos. Those sneered in the indictment were the whole upper crust of the Rats. Their leader, Dinty Colbeck, his top lieutenant, David Chippy Robinson, Oliver Doherty, Lewis Red Smith, Charles Red Lanham, Gus Dietmeyer, Frank Cotton Eppelsheimer, and Steve Ryan. And the Cuckoos taken down were gang leader Roy Tipton, Leo Cronin, and Rudolph Featherridge Schmidt. All were found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in Leavenworth. It was actually Roy Tipton of the Cuckoos who planned the 1923 mail truck robbery that netted the gangsters millions and 25 years in prison. The Cuckoos weren't completely crippled by the convictions like the Egan's Rats were. They suffered minor losses in manpower but were able to keep it moving. The Cuckoos were comprised of mostly Syrian and Lebanese gangsters and headed by the three Tipton brothers, Herman, Ray, and Roy. The Cuckoo Gang was formed when remnants of the Bottoms Gang joined up with the Chateau Avenue Gang. That group would eventually evolve to become the Cuckoo Gang. They operated largely in East St. Louis. The gang earned themselves a reputation for being fast and willing shooters who would scrap with anyone, anywhere, including each other. Extortion, robbery, kidnapping, and murder were their specialties. Things were looking up for the Cuckoo Gang in 1925 because they got back one of their top shooters. Cuckoo Gang member Tommy Hayes was released from prison after serving time for a payroll robbery pinch from 1921. Tommy the Rock Hayes was one of the baddest dudes in the game, a highly intelligent, lethal killer. Hayes was considered an unusual gangster because he came from a respectable family, went to college, didn't drink or smoke, and worked out to stay in shape. Tommy's police record began in 1913 when he was just 15. Since then, he seemed to have developed a deep hatred for cops. Several times when he was younger, he fought policemen who tried to arrest him. One particular incident in 1922 that added to his fearsome reputation was when Hayes was a wanted man in connection with a $46,000 holdup in Illinois. 4 detectives tracked him down and attempted to arrest him. Little did they know Tommy was going to make him work for it. When they tried to arrest him, he fought all 4 detectives like a savage. All 4 lawmen were battered and bruised before they were able to get the cuffs on Hayes. As a young man, he worked as a steel worker for a time and developed a physique that later made him feared for his imposing stature and physical prowess. He and other Cuckoo gangsters operated sills on the east side and worked as hired protection. He later became a guard for the operators of a big racing wire service. By the early 1920s, he became a top-tier gangster and an efficient killer. Most consider Tommy the Cuckoo's most feared and dangerous shooter. Not long after the bust that sent several Rat and Cuckoo members off to prison, Hayes really began to rise to the top echelon of the St. Louis underworld. He played a leading part during the gang wars and became known among the underworld for his cunning and ability. Hayes got out of prison just in the nick of time because his gang would soon be embroiled in a war with a Sicilian gang called the Green Ones. The Green Ones were the most prominent Sicilian faction in St. Louis in those days, and was started by the Giannola brothers, Vito and John, along with their good friend Alphonse Palazzolo. The trio financed their passage to the United States with several robberies in 1915. Once settled in St. Louis, they began recruiting their fellow Sicilian countrymen and imposed a tax in the city's Italian community on all goods sold. With little resistance, the trio established a foothold in the rackets. They took part in Black Hand tactics, extorting all the Italian business owners in the area. The gang they founded became known as the Green Ones. The moniker refers to the green pastures of the vast farming areas of Sicily from which the founding members are from. The other prominent and perhaps earliest Italian group operating in St. Louis during that time was referred to as the Pillow Gang. Active since 1910, the Pillow Gang, led by Sicilian Pasquale Centino, ran a small-scale Black Hand operation in St. Louis's Hill neighborhood, focusing on extortion and intimidation of local businesses and residents. The group swelled up and established control over gambling and prostitution rackets in South St. Louis. Santino would get a key acquisition in 1922 when Carmelo Frasina arrived in St. Louis and joined his gang. Frasina was a bright and cunning mafioso who had helped Santino run the rackets. Frasina immigrated to America at the age of 16. He worked his way up from a vegetable peddler to a steamship agent, and from there into the local mafia. Frasino is said to be brilliant and industrious, quickly working his way into the number 2 position in Santino's crew, as he and Santino began making big money in the illegal alcohol business. The Italian underworld lacked a strong leader early on. There wasn't a large, organized Italian mafia organization in existence in St. Louis back in those days. From 1910 to 1914, there was an ongoing battle between smaller Italian factions in the city. It seemed freelancing became the way of the mafiosi until new leadership came in the name of Dominic Giambroni in the late teens. Apparently, he's considered the first official boss of the St. Louis Mafia family, if you can even call him that. By the early 1920s, the Santino faction joined forces with the Green Ones to wrestle control away from Giambroni. They managed to kill most of his guys, forcing him out. He hightailed it out of St. Louis in 1924, only to return 10 years later and was promptly murdered. In the aftermath of their victory, the Green Ones appropriated leadership of the family for themselves, with Giannola becoming boss and Palazzolo his underboss. Their actions immediately created tension with the Santino crew. The lack of a traditional vote seemed to rub a lot of guys the wrong way, even in their own ranks. A meeting was held, things were said, and promises were broken, causing a mutiny within the ranks. There was a faction within the Green Ones that was Sicilian American. These guys were born in America, while the rest of the gang were all born and raised in Sicily. The rest of the gang referred to this faction as the Americans. They were led by Tony Shorty Russo, along with his brothers and their right-hand man, Vincent Spaguzza. It would be this faction that rebelled and broke away from the gang to start their own splinter group, accurately dubbed the Russo Gang. I know a lot of y'all don't like this guy. I just couldn't think of anything clever for Russo. Here you go. Is this any better? Then the Pillow Gang joined forces with the Russo Gang to fight the Green Ones. It seemed like it was one gang war after another. With many gangs come many conflicts. The Italian mafia in St. Louis was very fragmented. While a normal mob family had a traditional pyramid-like hierarchy structure, the 3 different factions in St. Louis operated with a degree of autonomy not seen in other American mafia groups of that era. Of course, this particular arrangement led to constant bickering and fighting amongst the faction leaders. As the 20s rolled along, the Green Ones were gaining a foothold over the rackets. By 1923, they rose to dominate the bootlegging trade. Because they're the most prominent Italian faction at the time, most mob historians credit Vito Giannola as St. Louis's second official mob boss of record. Vito Giannola was a proud Sicilian and experienced mafioso. His whole focus was to eventually take over St. Louis and control everything. That same year, Vito moved to take over the wholesale meat industry. To demonstrate how ruthless these Sicilians are, one reluctant distributor objected and was brutally murdered as an example to others. His mutilated body was found under the Kings Highway Viaduct on September 16, 1923. An even more profound example would be when 2 police officers tried to shake down the Green Ones in January of 26. Two officers, Omar Hockett and John Balk, approached one of the Green One's SIL operations demanding a payoff. After ignoring an opening offer of $200, the two lawmen waited until the boss arrived. They were eventually greeted by 4 members of the gang who proceeded to beat them unconscious. The following day, they were taken into the woods and made to dig their own graves. The 2 men were then shot and buried. The summer of 1926 would be a turning point for the Green Ones. In June, they killed Cuckoo-connected bootlegger Harvey Dunn. That was the last straw for the Cuckoo Gang as they declared war against the Green Ones. Not long after, Cuckoo shot at Alphonse Palazzolo and Frank Agrusa in front of Club Santa Fera. Palazzolo managed to dodge the gunfire, but Agrusa wasn't so lucky. He was hit, but survived. The Cuckoos struck again in early September when they shot and killed Green Ones members Cesar Cipriano and Joseph Manzella. A few days later, the Green Ones answered back with the gangland slaying of Cuckoo Gang member Anthony Webby. The volley of murders between the Green Ones and the Cuckoos died down a bit by the end of 1926. By then, police attributed at least 13 murders to the conflict. Vito Giannola met with Herman Tipton and were able to finally make peace, but not before the Green Ones took some major losses. It was evident they were on the losing end of the feud. That was a real black eye for the Green Ones, as the other mafia leaders around the country were looking down on the Giannolas. First, they couldn't hold their organization together and let a faction splinter off, and then they lost a mob war to a smaller non-Italian gang. Meanwhile, the dissenting remarks made and breaking away from their organization made Alphonse Palazzolo's blood boil. He wasn't as concerned with the Cuckoos picking him off left and right as he was with the Russo brothers taking a portion of his gang away. Alphonse Palazzolo was a leader in the gang and Vito Giannola's number 2, which is confusing for some because John Giannola is Vito's brother. John wasn't cut from the same cloth as his brother and Alphonse. He was a sugar wholesaler and was used for that all through their bootlegging days. Palazzolo was a cunning mafioso and a stone-cold killer. Ever since Spaguzza and Russo broke off and started a renegade faction, Palazzolo's been plotting their murders. Palazzolo, always fond of the ambush method, knew these experienced gangsters wouldn't be that easily duped. He was somehow able to lure both Russo and Spaguzza to Chicago. It was there where the Russo gang leaders were ambushed by a Green Ones hit team that of course included Palazzolo himself. Both Russo and Spaguzza were viciously beaten and killed courtesy of a few powerful rounds of a .45 automatic. After the successful double murder of the 2 rebels, Alphonse Palazzolo was pretty proud of himself. Little did he know it would be his turn soon. The following month, in September of 27, Palazzolo was with Pasquale Santino, the leader of the Pillow Gang faction. The 2 mob leaders were standing in front of a pool hall as they both watched a large Chrysler speed by. The sedan continued a short distance and then quickly turned around to make another pass. Palazzolo didn't know this then, but the car contained a Russo Gang hit team, and it was his head on the chopping block this time. Then Russo's top enforcer and hitter, Jack Griffin, hopped out and started running towards Palazzolo, firing his pistol. Palazzolo drew his own gun and returned fire, but by that time a swarm of lead was heading his way, courtesy of the shotguns the guys in the car were wielding. Palazzolo was hit multiple times and went down. Griffin continues to walk over to Palazzolo and then stood right over him and pumped several more rounds into his face and head for good measure. When the melee was over and the dust settled, 2 innocent bystanders were hit but only wounded. Santino managed to get through the ordeal unscathed. Unfortunately for Palazzolo, he was hit over 20 times from head to foot and was about as dead as it gets. It has been said that Santino was there to finger Palazzolo to the hitmen. Whether that's true or not, Santino's days were also numbered. What really put Santino's head on the chopping block was the fact he thought he could testify against a couple of the Russo brothers, and nobody would do anything about that. It became apparent Santino would get his real soon. His number would come up a couple months later in November 27. Santino was lured to a meeting place, and as soon as he admitted his identity, he was pumped full of lead. The police have since claimed to have information that the Green Ones brought in a hitman from Chicago to do the job. After Santino was murdered in 1927, Frasina took over the gang and became allies with the Russo Gang, and together they waged war against the Green Ones. More blood spilled over the following 2 months, culminating in the death of the Green Ones' boss Vito Giannola in December of 28. Vito would ultimately get tracked down at his mistress's house. The whole town pretty much knows about Vito's mistress, mainly because of how blatantly he acquired said mistress. This average civilian, Peter Cusimano, was driving home from work one day when his path was blocked by Vito Giannola. Peter recognized the wealthy black hander, but was curious as to why in the world he would want to talk to him. Vito walked up to Cusimano and said, and I quote, "You are to leave town tonight, or I'll have my men kill you. I want your wife Augustina. I will take care of her and the children. Don't you write to her, or I'll have you traced and killed. No one can escape me." Peter Cusimano was so frightened he went straight to the train station. He didn't grab any clothes or any possessions from the house. He took a train to Detroit, where he lived out the rest of his life. It must be noted that whether Vito is the good guy or bad guy in this little side story hinges on one detail that sources are mixed on, and that's if Cusimano beat his wife. If he did, Vito looks like a knight in shining armor. If not, he's a total dick. It seems that infidelity is commonplace in the mafia. Time and time again we hear about these guys having two separate families they deal with simultaneously. Well, that's how Vito rolled, and he would often visit Augustina, making his routine somewhat predictable. During one of these visits while Vito's at her house, a couple policemen came and knocked on her door. Giannola was on the phone at the time and seemed to quickly recognize that these guys aren't cops, and fled to the top floor and hid in a secret compartment. Vito's instincts were correct. The two men at her door masquerading as cops were in fact two Russo hitmen with bad intentions. They were Mike DiTillo and Jack Griffin. It was Jack that saw Giannola take off up the stairs and chased after him. After taking a moment to look for him, Griffin ripped away a partition, exposing the mob boss. He then opened up on him and shredded Giannola with a Thompson submachine gun. The coroner reportedly pulled 37 slugs out of him out of the 95 shots he took. Top Russo gunman Jack Griffin was a ruthless killer and almost single-handedly took out the leadership of the Sicilian mob by mowing down both Palazzolo and Giannola. Jack was the Russo brothers' most trusted and valued associate. The Irish-American Griffin was trusted implicitly by the Sicilian-American Russo brothers. They all grew up in the same neighborhood together and were lifelong friends. Griffin reportedly had a working knowledge of the Italian language because of what he picked up just being around Italian so much. The Russos jokingly nicknamed him Biunu, which is Sicilian for blonde or blondie. I know I butchered that, my apologies. Griffin eventually became known as their top triggerman and was suspected in many killings. Due to his savagery and blatant disregard for his enemies, Griffin was subject to multiple attempts on his life, surviving a total of 13 bullet wounds from weapons such as pistols, Thompson submachine guns, and high-powered rifles. The brutal and brazen murder of Giannola made front-page news. Vito was a prominent, notorious figure in St. Louis, so this got the underworld buzzing. Vito's death put the Sicilian underworld in a state of flux. The Green Ones held a conference soon after Vito Giannola's funeral. John Giannola had enough of the violence. After his brother's death, he gave up his position in the gang and hightailed it out of town and dropped off the radar. At this meeting, 26-year-old Frank Greeny Agrusa was dubbed the new boss. Having spent many years under Vito's tutelage, Agrusa was a perfect choice. Learning from his predecessor's mistakes, Frankie knew that a low profile was the way to go. While Vito liked to strut down the street and let everyone know he was a gangster, Agrusa was the exact opposite, low-key and operating in the shadows. Frankie's right-hand man and now underboss is his longtime friend and partner in crime, Vito Impastato. These gang wars were taking their toll on the city and the gang members involved. For a time, St. Louis was transformed into a mafia chessboard-type battleground, as these wars were ripe with strategic power moves full of betrayal, double crosses, and ambushes. These guys had to stay sharp and on their toes if they wanted to survive all of this. Machiavellian twists and turns are at the core of any mafia war, and the St. Louis conflicts definitely showcase that. As these battles raged on, it seems like the deception and double dealing was limitless. While Charlie Frasino was ostensibly allied with the Russo Gang, he was going behind their back and extorting wealthy merchants connected to and supposed to be protected by the Russos. When Jimmy Russo got word of Frasino's shenanigans, he promptly began planning his murder. On the night of January 19, 1928, Frasino was out making his extortion rounds and visited the Dogtown home of Charles Spaguzza to collect his tribute payment. The gang boss was backed up by two bodyguards, Dominic Cataldo and Tony DiTrapani. The latter packed a sawed-off 12-gauge autoloader. Charles was a cousin of Frasino's predecessor, the late Vincent Spaguzza, and ran a fruit company. After talking with his visitors for a while, Spaguzza eventually gave Frasino over $1,000 cash. The three men exited the front door when they noticed a couple strangers standing by a car parked out by the curb. Since the house sat at a weird angle above the street, Forsina and his men couldn't clearly see the faces of the strangers. The mob boss immediately grabbed Spaguzza and forced him to walk down to the street to find out just who these fellows were. The fruit merchant slowly walked down the steep steps. When Spaguzza got close enough to recognize the familiar faces, he immediately broke right and ran for cover. As soon as he was clear, a swarm of shotgun and submachine gun fire erupted from the street. Forsina instantly turned to go back inside the house, only to be shot in the rear end by a machine gun round. Di Trapani was struck repeatedly by the same stream of bullets. He spun around, stumbled inside the foyer, and fell face down on top of his unfired shotgun. Cataldo tried to follow Spaguzza but was picked off by a .45 caliber bullet to the dome. When the dust settled, his two bodyguards were killed, but Forsina got lucky and was only shot in the ass. The nagging wound on his backside would bother him every time he sat down, so Forsina would carry around a pillow to sit on. So if you've been a little curious as to why these guys are called the Pillow Gang, this is how they acquired that moniker. Police initially suspected that the Green Ones were responsible. It wasn't until much later that they discovered that the true culprits were the Russo Gang. Now all three Italian mob factions are at war with one another. Jimmy Russo continued his attempts to avenge the murder of his brother Shorty. 6 months after the ambush on Forsina, Russo and his top two lieutenants, Mike the Chink Longo and Jack Griffin, were lured to a meeting with the ostensibly neutral Cuckoo Gang. I tell you, it seems like it's one ambush after another, and the Cuckoos were looking to take out the Russo leadership. They sprang a ferocious trap, and as soon as everyone got settled, Cuckoo's ace hitman Tommy Hayes popped out of nowhere, wielding a Tommy gun, and started spraying, peppering these guys with bullets. Russo and Longo were all shot up and were killed. That Griffin has grit. He was hit with 6 bullets but managed to survive the attack. Things just kept getting worse for the Russo Gang. They were severely crippled in July of '28 when the St. Louis police rounded up the surviving Russo brothers and deported them. Whatever was left of the Russo Gang after the remaining brothers were deported continued to battle the Pillow Gang and the Green Ones until their faction disintegrated around 1932. These mob wars took a toll on the Green Ones. They took the L in their battle with the Cuckoo Gang and then had to turn around and take on a former faction of their own organization, the Russo Gang, who took out their leadership and almost finished them off. Although they tried to continue with their remaining guys, by the end of the 1920s, the gang had become nearly an obscurity. As for the Italian factor in general, it would be another few years before St. Louis would have a fully formed mafia family in place. The Green Ones left a lasting legacy in the city as they played a major part in the origin story of the St. Louis Mafia. They also set the precedence of savagery through the extreme violence they demonstrated, raising the bar of violence and murder for the future generations of mafiosi in St. Louis. During the short reign of Giannola and Palazzolo, police records show 30 people were murdered and 18 wounded. Interestingly, among the wounded was James Licavoli, the future boss of the Cleveland Mafia. Licavoli was shot by police as they attempted to arrest his buddy, Joseph Bomarito, a member of the Green Ones. The police killed Bomarito when he resisted arrest. The Cuckoos were soon involved in yet another gang battle. That Herman Tipton is a pretty nice guy, and he lent their guns to Carl Shelton so his Southern Illinois gang could fight the Burger Gang. When the Burger Gang was eliminated in 1930, the Sheltons reneged and kept their guns and wanted to take over their territory, so they ordered the Cuckoos out of East St. Louis. Herman Tipton was not happy about getting bamboozled by Shelton and refused to leave. He was enjoying the sudden bootlegging wealth he acquired here, plus his pride wouldn't allow him to get bullied by the Sheltons. The two gangs would face off against each other, dropping more bodies onto the streets of St. Louis. After about a dozen or so killings, Carl Shelton decided to switch it up and try to take out the Cuckoos from the inside. That Carl Shelton was a sneaky guy. He happened to be friendly with the Cuckoos' top hitter, Tommy Hayes, and wanted to exploit that relationship. So he convinced him to split from the gang and turn on Tipton. Then in February of '31, Hayes led an attack on a roadhouse in which he was supposed to turn on his gang. Carl Shelton and his brothers were really anticipating this, as they were expecting mass loss for the Cuckoos. But on the contrary, after the prolonged shootout, it was 3 Shelton men who were killed. Now it's unknown if Hayes did actually betray Tipton and just had a bad day, or if he just told Shelton what he wanted to hear to get an edge on the opposing gang and never actually switched sides. Nevertheless, Shelton suspected a double-cross and wasn't going to take any chances, so he in turn double-crossed Hayes. On April 15, 1932, Hayes was found in Madison, Illinois with 12 slugs in his back, courtesy of the Sheltons. The double dealing seemed to be commonplace for the Shelton gang and would eventually lead to their demise. The Shelton Gang would eventually get taken out by their most prominent member and their number one enforcer, Frank Buster Wortman. Wortman was an important part of the gang that terrorized southern Illinois in the 1920s and early 30s. He was very active those early years and was arrested 35 to 40 times. It would be a pinch he took in 1933 that would change everything for Wortman. He was guarding one of the Shelton sills one evening when it was raided by federal agents. Apparently Buster wasn't going down without a fight and proceeded to beat up one of the agents and would be sent to Leavenworth over the incident. When he was released in 41, he returned to find that Prohibition had been repealed and the old-style gangs were vanishing and being replaced with racket bosses. But it seems Wortman made some good connections in prison because once out he represented the Chicago outfit and was controlled by Sam Giancana himself. Now backed by one of the premier mob families in the country, the sky was the limit. He put a solid crew together and formed Wortman's Plaza Amusement Company and got to work. Buster was a natural. He specialized in gambling and his rackets were thriving. Wortman oversaw a large territory in East St. Louis and Peoria, Illinois. He's said to have a hell of a violence streak. FBI files state that Wortman retained control of his domain by killing all his competitors. Buster harbored some resentment toward his old boss, Bernie Shelton, as he blames him for his prior incarceration. He also wanted to expand, so two birds, one stone. He then launched a campaign in the early 40s to drive the Sheltons from southern Illinois. When everything was said and done, the Shelton brothers were no more, and then it didn't take long before Buster obtained a virtual monopoly on gambling, specifically slot and pinball machines, horse parlors, card and crap games in East St. Louis and southern Illinois. He also established legitimate businesses like trucking firms and taverns that he ran with his brother Ted. By the late 40s, he completely ran East St. Louis and southern Illinois. Almost any major illegal activity committed was attributed to the Wortman Gang. In the mid-1950s, Wortman moved from his modest ranch-style brick home to a castle fit for a king on the east end of Collinsville. His new fortified fortress had a steel roof and was surrounded by a water-filled moat, with the only access being a guarded drawbridge. Although his power began to decline in his later years, Wortman remained in control of gambling in East St. Louis until his death from cancer on August 3, 1968. Battling the Green Ones and then the Shelton Gang back-to-back crippled the Cuckoo Gang. Then losing Tommy Hayes effectively ended the Cuckoo Gang as a force in the St. Louis underworld, although as with Egan Rats members, a few Cuckoos would be around for decades. The Egan's Rats, for all intents and purposes, ceased to be an organized crime power after the imprisonment of most of its top members following the 1923 robbery. Their fearless leader, Dinty Colbeck, was finally released and was a free man after 16 years in prison. He tried to get back into the rackets, but his comeback was short-lived. On February 17, 1943, Colbeck was driving home at around 10:30 p.m. when a car pulled alongside his and a man with a Thompson submachine gun opened up on him, filling his body full of lead. And with that, Colbeck's criminal career was over at the age of 58. A few former Rats members would gain notoriety in their later years, such as these two guys. Fred Killer Burke and Gus Winkler and their crew relocated to Chicago to work for the big guy himself, Al Capone. Unlike most other mob bosses around the country, Capone loved to utilize non-Italians. Some of the highest positions in the organization were reserved for non-Italians, such as Murray Humphreys and Jay Guzik, as Capone set the precedence for many future non-Italians to hold prominent positions in the Chicago Mafia. It seems Capone genuinely liked Burke and his crew and referred to them as his American boys. Besides Burke, the crew included Gus Winkler, Fred Goetz, Bob Carey, and Raymond Crane Neck Nugent. These battle-hardened hoodlums were used anytime Capone wanted plausible deniability and to distance himself and his organization from a particular hit or job. And all these guys were former Egan's Rats. Capone apparently respected Fred Burke's gunplay because he used him on some pretty big hits. Burke is said to have participated in arguably the biggest hit of all time, the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. In the previous year, he was part of a four-man hit team dispatched to New York by Al Capone to take out his former friend turned rival Frankie Yale. They managed to kill Yale by firing through a rolled-down window on his brand-new bulletproof car while driving next to him. Pretty incredible. That's some good shooting. If they would have missed, that would have created a whole new set of problems for Capone. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was Burke on the other end of that Tommy gun. Here's a little fun fact for you. The assassination of Frankie Yale was the first time a Thompson submachine gun was used in a gangland killing in New York. After getting away with so many murders, it would be an unnecessary bonehead move that would cause his undoing. I'm not sure how a guy like Burke could think he can get away with shooting a cop in front of witnesses. Well, that's exactly what happened on December 14th, 1929. Burke was in a minor fender bender with another car when Officer Charles Scully, who was helping direct traffic, hopped onto the running board of Burke's Hudson and directed both drivers to drive to the police station. After a few blocks, they came to a stop at a traffic light. As soon as the light turned green, Burke pulled a Colt .45 automatic from the door pocket and fired 3 shots into Scully's body right there in broad daylight, leaving the officer dead in the middle of the intersection. The ensuing investigation turned up a small arsenal when they searched Burke's house. It included ammunition, 3 bulletproof vests, several revolvers, sawed-off shotguns, hand grenades, tear gas bombs, and 2 Thompson submachine guns. It was one of Burke's machine guns that ballistics experts tied to both the massacre and the murder of Frankie Yale in New York City in 1928. Burke was eventually apprehended and later convicted of the policeman's murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died of a heart attack in July of 1940 before any other charges could be brought against him. Other former rats who would go on to have much longer, more successful careers in the mafia were brothers Pete and Yanni Licavoli. After the rats disintegrated, the pair would head north to the Motor City, join the Purple Gang, and later founded the River Gang and had long prosperous mafia careers. Another ex-rat to gain notoriety, especially in Chicago, was Leo Brothers, the guy who was convicted of the murder of Chicago Tribune reporter Jake Lingle in 1930. Brothers was a St. Louis hoodlum who specialized in labor-related strong-arm work. Officially employed as an organizer in the mob-controlled United Service Car Drivers Association, if any service car drivers wouldn't fall in line, Leo Brothers was the one they would call to rough them up or stink bomb or dynamite their car. He wasn't afraid to whack a guy either. On the evening of August 2nd, 1929, service car driver John de Blasi, who helped lead a revolt of drivers away from the mob-run union, pulled up to his apartment, and as he walked to the back door, a sedan quickly pulled up from the opposite direction. Leo Brothers jumped out and yelled, "Hey, cocksucker!" and then shot de Blasi, hitting him multiple times in the chest and killing him. Within hours after the murder, Leo was heading north on his way to Chicago. Exactly how Brothers was brought into the fold of the Capone mob is unknown. What is known is that Leo Brothers would turn up in the winter of 1930 as a bouncer and then eventually manager of the mobbed-up swanky Green Mill Jazz Club. Jake Lingle was a Chicago Tribune reporter who courted both sides of the Chicago mob and paid dearly for it. He was dealing with these mob guys so much he eventually fancied himself a wise guy. Lingle's friendship with Commissioner William Russell got him privileged information on raids. Jake would take a payoff from mobsters and guarantee they could run their establishments hassle-free. He got pretty close to Capone at one point, feeding him inside info on his enemies and impending raids. Jake got so close to the big guy he was one of the lucky few who got a diamond-studded belt buckle as a gift from the mob boss. Then Jake got cocky, demanding more and more from mobsters, stating that he decides what the going rate is for booze in Chicago. He assumed that because of his status as a friend to the commissioner and Al Capone that no one would dare kill him. Jake was dealing with gangsters and their rivals at the same time, feeding both sides information on each other. This incensed Capone once he found out, and once he did, Al refused to meet up with them and no longer accepted his calls. Jake then went into business with the Northsiders to open a dog track on the west side. Jake promised that for $2,500 he could get the place open and unmolested from the law. Northside racketeer Jake Zuda then paid him the scratch. Lingle took the money but then reneged on his promise and the deal fell through. To add insult to injury, Lingle never bothered to give back the $2,500 to Zuda. When asked about it, Lingle said he would not pay a cent back. Angry at being shafted, Zuda immediately began to orchestrate Lingle's murder, arranging for Pasqualino Patsy Tardy to be the triggerman. June 9, 1930, Lingle decides to head off to the racetrack. As he enters the Illinois track tunnel, Tardy, who's waiting in the shadows, creeps next to him, lifts his .38 to Jake's head just behind his ear, and squeezes the trigger, instantly killing the double-dealing reporter. And with that, the Lingle problem was over. Jake Lingle's success in navigating the murky Chicago underworld seems to have gone to his head. He got a little too big for his britches and overplayed his hand. The audacity he had to think he could screw over these gangsters and they're not going to do nothing to him was very short-sighted and underscored his arrogance. Once he lost Capone as a protector, it was just a matter of time before he was dealt with. It's apparent some kind of underworld deal was made because when the dust settled, it was Leo Brothers that went to prison for Jake Lingle's murder. It seems that Brothers agreed to be the scapegoat, either for a payday or a pass on a past gambling debt he owed the outfit. This gesture was also done to appease the public as well as the police. This whole incident was very high profile at the time and was sensationalized by the press. They had a field day with this, constantly writing about it in the paper. The terms were probably all ironed out beforehand because Brothers received the minimum sentence for the murder and served only 8 years. After the verdict was read, Leo was quoted as saying, "I can do that standing on my head." And he did. And afterwards he was released without fanfare and died of natural causes in 1951. In the mid-1940s, the disarray of the Italian underworld in St. Louis was a hot topic in mafia circles nationwide. What was seen as a lack of leadership in St. Louis by most other families saw a business opportunity. It was the Kansas City family who would jump at the opportunity to capitalize from the city's lack of organization and stability. The KC leadership would dispatch Thomas Buffa and Tony Lopaparo to organize things and oversee the family's interest. Buffa arrived in St. Louis in 1922 and joined the Pillow Gang. He would patiently wait for his chance to take over. Meanwhile, Frasino was losing it. He would make headlines in August of '29 after firing a shotgun at federal agents who were in the process of raiding his home. He didn't hit anybody, but he now gave him something to prosecute him on. About a year later, Frasino would be convicted of assault with intent to kill and sentenced to prison time. Just before he was due to head to jail on May 8, 1931, Frasino was found shot to death behind the wheel of his car in an isolated forested area outside Edwardsville, Illinois. Leave it up to that illustrious senatorial probe Orestes Kefauver to sum up Frasino's career with humor he seldom seemed to possess when he said, "Eventually, Frasino, an extortionist and bootlegger, was dispatched with 2 bullets in the head and no longer needed his pillow." A couple years later, a Grusa would go down too. In 1944, Frankie One-Ear Fratto from the Chicago outfit's Des Moines wing murdered Green One's boss Frank Greeny Agrusa in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Apparently, the hit came down from Chicago because after putting in the work, Fratto received his button. After Frasino's death, Buffa seized the opportunity and took control of the leadership of the Pillow Gang and began to consolidate Italian organized crime in the city. Remnants of the Green Ones and the Russo Gang joined forces with the Pillow Gang, and before you knew it, the Italians were finally functioning as one family with Buffa as boss. Buffa was finally the boss, but that seemed to have gone to his head because he thought he was above the rules. He did the unthinkable. He testified against the girlfriend of a KC mobster. He knew he messed up and was now in hot water with the KC mob. He fled St. Louis to hide out in California. Shortly after his arrival, he was gunned down in Lodi, California. It was almost impossible to hide out from the mob during those years. The leadership of organized crime in St. Louis was a little sketchy in the late 40s. It seems that former KC mobster Tony Lopaparo took over as boss and, like Buffa, had overseen St. Louis operations as a subordinate arm of the Kansas City crime family. He was running the family along with Frank Three Fingers Coppola and Shorty Ralph Calica, both former Green Ones. Coppola was a major drug trafficker and had been involved in the drug trade in Detroit and New Orleans as well as St. Louis. Immigration caught up with him before the law did, and he was eventually deported back to Italy. He continued to traffic drugs into the U.S. when he was living in Italy, which put him in direct competition with Lucky Luciano in the drug trade there. In the late 40s and early 50s, Coppola was using mob up-and-comer Tony Giordano as a drug courier. Giordano would travel to Italy to meet Coppola, who would supply the pure heroin to Giordano, and then Tony would bring it back to St. Louis. During one of these trips in 1950, Giordano had been under the surveillance of the Narcotics Bureau. Upon arriving to Coppola's farm to pick up the shipment, the Italian newspapers broke a story of a major international drug smuggling ring bust in San Diego. It seems that got Giordano's spidey sense tingling. Spooked by the turn of events, Giordano decided to play it safe and return home empty-handed. In spite of the disappointment of the unsuccessful trip, it turned out the young mobster actually used pretty wise judgment. Come to find out years later, Giordano was under surveillance, and had he tried to return with the heroin, he would have been arrested and given a very long prison sentence. Giordano, who had built his stock in the local underworld by the mid-1950s through involvement in gambling and narcotics, was showing signs of strong leadership qualities and was being groomed to lead the family by Tony Lapp and Ralph Calica. During this period, the St. Louis family developed closer ties to the Detroit family instead of the Kansas City family. Wise guys from Detroit and St. Louis were involved in narcotics trafficking together. St. Louis also relied heavily on Detroit for support in gambling operations, which formed the cornerstone of St. Louis's mafia revenue. Tony Lapp ruled for about a decade in relative harmony. Tony Giordano would eventually ascend to the position of boss of the St. Louis crime family following the death of his predecessor in 1960. Upon assuming control, Giordano asserted the St. Louis family's independence from Kansas City, notifying its leadership that the organization would no longer operate as an extension. This move severed long-standing oversight ties, enabling greater autonomy in rackets such as labor unions and illegal gambling. Giordano's elevation stabilized the Italian-American faction, consolidating power under a single hierarchy with underboss John Vitale. Vitale was Giordano's right-hand man and voice on the street. John was Tony's support with the rank and file. Giordano was all about unity, something that St. Louis desperately needed. Instead of competing with other criminal organizations in St. Louis, it seems Giordano was cooperating in illegal activities with two other factions. The first group was a Syrian-Lebanese-led group headed by aging former Cuckoo gangster Jimmy Michaels, and the other group was identified as remnants of the Lake Frank Buster Wortman's East Side Gang that's now headed by Art Byrne. Michael's career began in the 1920s when he was known as Horseshoe Jimmy and was a member of the Cuckoo Gang. At 19, he was arrested for robbing the Illinois Central Freight Depot in East St. Louis. He skipped bond but was recaptured a year later. While out, he was arrested as a suspect in several gangland killings. They didn't have the evidence to convict him on any murders, but he did serve a total of 13 years for the robbery and was paroled in 1944. Once out, he got right back to the rackets, specializing in gambling, and eventually getting heavily involved in labor racketeering. He has since rose to become one of the top racketeers in St. Louis. Art Byrne was installed by the Chicago outfit to take over East St. Louis and Southern Illinois after the death of Wortman. No significant internal challenges to Giordano's succession arose, allowing the family to focus on expansion during the 1960s. And expand they did, right into Las Vegas, along with a few other Midwest families. The St. Louis family managed to control two Las Vegas casinos, the Dunes and the Aladdin. Giordano would end up getting indicted trying to get control of a third casino. During the mid-70s, he attempted to gain hidden ownership in the Frontier Casino in Vegas with Detroit mobsters Michael Palizzi and Anthony Zerilli. The three would get convicted for their efforts. Giordano was sent to prison in 1975 and released in December of '77. Giordano's tenure provided much-needed cohesion and stability to a growing borgata. An era of peace and prosperity that followed enabled growth in their numbers and in racket revenue. Many weren't aware that Giordano was single-handedly keeping the peace and preventing all-out warfare in a city previously ravaged by decades of gangland battles. No one was prepared for the death, destruction, and carnage that would follow immediately after his death. The death of longtime St. Louis boss Anthony Giordano on August 29, 1980 from cancer created a vicious power vacuum that ignited intense factional violence over control of key rackets, particularly Labor's Local 110. Giordano had previously mediated tensions between the different organized crime factions, most notably the Syrian-Lebanese group led by Jimmy Michaels and the Leisure Brothers, Paul, David, and Anthony, who sought greater influence in union operations. The post-Giordano ensuing conflict spanning through 1980 to the fall of '81 featured several car bombings and shootings, showcasing a rare but brazen outbreak of overt mob warfare. It all started in 1979 when Jimmy Michaels backed John Spica for a leadership position in the Union. Spica was a contract killer who was released from Missouri State Penitentiary in 1973 after serving 10 years of a life sentence for first-degree murder. This move by Michaels brought him into the opposition of the most violent labor racketeer in St. Louis, Raymond Flynn. Flynn then contacted Chicago outfit boss Joey Iuppa and asked him for permission to challenge Michaels' move. In other words, permission to whack Michaels. Flynn was told that the St. Louis family would not interfere with any of his actions as long as Michaels was not harmed due to his long-standing friendship with Giordano. So Flynn thought, okay, well if I can't whack Michaels, I'll whack his boy. On November 8, 1979, Spica stepped into his 1977 Cadillac, and when he touched the brake pedal, he detonated 8 sticks of dynamite. The explosion blew both his legs off, and the driver's door landed 30 yards away. After this killing, Michaels met with Giordano to appeal for help against Flynn. Giordano was then rebuffed by Iuppa and told not to interfere with the power struggle. However, he can assure Michaels that no harm would come to him. Flynn was a crafty guy. If he can't kill Michaels, he's got to figure out other ways to hurt him. This time he figured he'd go after his muscle. Flynn approached Anthony and Paul Leisure, members of Michaels' Syrian faction, and lured them away with high-salary jobs within the Union. The gritty double-cross enraged Michaels, who had supported the Leisures for years and gave Anthony an officer's position at Local 110. And then it happened. The glue keeping all these pieces together was gone. Anthony Giordano succumbed to cancer in his St. Louis home. Following his death, Flynn was informed by IUPA that any arrangement that Giordano had to protect his friend Michaels was canceled out by his death. Well, that's exactly what Flynn was hoping IUPA would say, and he didn't waste much time before making his next move. Just 19 days after Giordano's death, David Leisure crawled under Michael's black Chrysler Cordoba, which was parked outside St. Raymond's Church, and planted a remote-controlled bomb under the driver's seat. Michaels left the church, driving on I-55 in South St. Louis County when Anthony Leisure detonated the bomb. The explosion sent the automobile bouncing 3 feet in the air. The force of the explosion tore Michael's legs to pieces, and parts of his body was hurled against a passing car, and the rest of his body was sent flying into the center of the highway, 55 yards from where the car came to a stop. Less than a year after Jimmy Michaels' murder, his loyalists retaliated by planting a bomb under Paul Leisure's car outside his home on August 11, 1981. The ensuing blast cost him his right leg and his left foot and severely disfigured his face. The Leisures were now out for blood and going after anybody connected to Michaels, even innocent family. Members of the Flynn faction struck back a month later on September 11th by wounding Charles John Michaels, Jimmy's grandson, outside the Edge restaurant. Authorities were surprised at the shooting because Michaels, who had no record, was not involved in the Union power struggle. And then on October 16th, George Faheen, Jimmy's nephew, was killed by another car bomb. Again, authorities were baffled because Faheen was a city worker and not involved in the Union power struggle. With the death of Giordano and the subsequent murders that followed, Vitali tried desperately to keep the peace between the warring factions, but was unsuccessful. Vitali got frustrated with all the havoc, and apparently threw in the towel and became an informant for the FBI in 1981, and began feeding them information on the war going on between the Michaels gang and the Leisures. One of the hoodlums Vitali tried to set up for the FBI was Jesse Stone King, a lieutenant of Art Byrne, the East St. Louis Rackets boss who replaced Buster Wortman. Stone King, an ex-choir boy, had made a name for himself in the mob after being taken under the wing of Byrne. Stone King's reputation for violence was well known in St. Louis. A former reporter of the St. Louis Post once said of Stone King, his presence alone was menacing. Built more like a bull than a man, he could talk, fight, or shoot his way out of a jam. Stone King was indeed a killer, but he was unique in the fact that he was a hitman with a conscience. Byrne once gave him a contract to whack a guy in a wheelchair, but he refused to go through with it because the guy was already in a wheelchair. In October of '79, he murdered a man who raped a girlfriend of his mentor Byrne. And in December of '79, he killed 2 men who tried to set him up for a hit. After the death of Jimmy Michaels, Vitali tried to set him up for the FBI by offering Stone King $5,000 to get him a bomb. That didn't work, but in September of '81, FBI agents arrested him for his involvement in an interstate stolen car ring and chop shop operation and gave him 3-year stretch to serve in prison. While he was serving time, Byrne was supposed to take care of his family, or families. He had 2, a wife with 3 kids and a girlfriend with 3 more kids. Byrne did nothing for him, and neither family was being taken care of. Stone King, feeling like he was double-crossed by Byrne, decided to flip. Meanwhile, at the age of 73, Vitali was becoming frail, to the point that he needed 2 canes to walk. On June 5, 1982, he died from heart disease. Meanwhile, the new St. Louis mob boss finally emerged. Mike Trupiano Jr. was identified by the FBI as the heir apparent to Giordano in the wake of Vitali's death in 1982. Trupiano, a nephew of Giordano, was born in Detroit. He was a hopeless gambling addict and got all messed up in gambling in Detroit, and they wanted to get rid of him, so they sent him to St. Louis for some guidance from his uncle. Described as a flashy, temperamental, and compulsive gambler, in May of '86, Trupiano was fined $30,000 and sentenced to 4 years in prison for running a gambling ring that handled bets on college and professional football games. During the trial, witnesses testified that Trupiano's bookmaking operation actually lost money. It was the first time federal agents ever heard of an underworld bookmaking operation running in the red. Many speculate this was caused by Trupiano himself, making bets and consistently losing. Meanwhile, law enforcement had been behind the scenes investigating the bombings and murders and was finally ready to lay down the hammer. And lay down the hammer they did. On March 24, 1982, James Michaels III, another grandson of Jimmy Michaels, and Milton Russell Shep, a former St. George, Missouri police chief, were charged with the Paul Leisure car bombing and sentenced to 5 years in prison. On April 14, 1983, 8 members of the Leisure faction were indicted on state capital murder charges and federal racketeering charges. Paul and Anthony Leisure, their cousin David, along with Steve Wagaman and Charles Lowe, were convicted on the federal charges. Paul and David Leisure were sentenced to 55 years in prison. Anthony Leisure received 40 years. All of their accomplices got 30 to 50 years in prison. These guys would be indicted again on state capital murder charges, and in the second trial they all again would be convicted. Paul and Anthony were both handed life sentences without the possibility of parole. David Leisure, however, in a mob rarity, was sentenced to death for his role in the murders. He was executed by lethal injection in 1999. Incredibly, David Leisure's death was the first execution of a member of organized crime since the electrocution of Louis Lepke Buckhalter at Sing Sing in 1944. Raymond Flynn, who was tried separately, was convicted by a federal jury for his role in the car bombings and sentenced to 55 years in prison in March of '87. He had his sentence reduced to 30 years after an appeal. It became apparent that Trupiano was inept as a boss and leader. In transcripts or recorded conversations, Trupiano is heard to say that he gets no respect from neither other mob families nor his own underlings. Other Midwest mob families cheated him out of money from a sale of a hotel in Las Vegas, and Trupiano claimed his own soldiers were holding out on him from their bookmaking take. They probably thought he was going to blow most of it on gambling. His lifelong gambling addiction was well known in mafia circles nationwide, and probably the main source of the disrespect he gets. His gambling addiction was detrimental to his reign as boss of the St. Louis mob. No matter what happened, he could never kick the habit. Trupiano was an officer of Labor's Local 110 and was voted out of office for playing cards on union time. The FBI kept him under so close surveillance, he was arrested in 1991 for running an illegal gin rummy game in the back room of a used car dealership. Trupiano was convicted on 1 of 6 counts and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison and told by the judge to shun gambling in all forms. Some sound advice by the judge. Stone King's undercover informant role for the FBI absolutely crushed the St. Louis crime family. His work as an informant over the next 2 years would result in the imprisonment of 30 members of organized crime, including Byrne and Trupiano. Trupiano served 16 months, and by the time he was released from prison, the St. Louis mob had dwindled to a handful of soldiers. Trupiano's health deteriorated in prison. He suffered from diabetes and underwent daily kidney dialysis and already had suffered 1 heart attack. He died after suffering a second heart attack on October 22, 1997. In the wake of Trupiano's death, 2 wise guy old-timers who managed to survive both the mob wars and the government indictments, Anthony Perrino and Joseph Gamarata, emerged as the leaders of what was left of the St. Louis crime family. Camerata took over as underboss in 1980 after Vitale died and elected to stay put after Trupiano died, allowing Perrino to take over as boss, and Camerata would continue to serve as underboss. Camerata died in 2013 and Perrino in 2014, after which most consider the St. Louis family defunct. The last known St. Louis crime family member was Fernando Nando Bartolotta. St. Louis isn't really known as a big mafia city, even though they've had a rich history of consistent gangland battles. These blood-soaked streets of St. Louis have seen many years of gang wars as several generations of organized crime factions have battled it out for racket supremacy. Many colorful characters have come and gone, and even though most were casualties of the gangland warfare, they've been forever immortalized in the memories of the people that shared the streets with these gun-toting gangsters. The extreme violence that St. Louis has endured is forever etched in the pages of the history of American organized crime in the city.